welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. In this episode, we'll be discussing a recent report published by the Internet Society, which sought to examine the extent to which consolidation of the Internet economy has been occurring and some of the likely implications of that consolidation. To take us through the report and to help us understand the anticipated impact of this consolidation, we are delighted to have Carl Gahnberg, who is a policy advisor at the Internet Society, where he focuses on issues related to Internet governance. In our conversation with Carl, in addition to examining the report, we will spend some time discussing how consolidation of the Internet economy might affect developing countries, as well as entrepreneurship and innovation, the implications of key fractures in the Internet that have been emerging, and how developing countries should approach building their Internet economies in light of the consolidation that has been occurring. Carl, welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to join you today.
Excellent. All right, so let's just start with why did the Internet Society want to produce such a report?
Well, I think the best way to sort of understand why an organization like us would focus a report on this topic is to go a little bit back and look at our mission as an organization. Our main mission is, if you were to go to our website, we're working for an internet to be open, globally connected, secure, and trustworthy. And that might sound like a bit of a mouthful for a lot of people, but in essence, it really comes back to this notion of the internet as a network of networks. So this understanding that might have been the prevalent idea just 25 years ago when I went to middle school, when we heard about the internet, it was this network of networks. And this is really where our organization is focused. And in that regard, we think that this network of network that is the internet comes with some really important characteristics with the internet that is really important to protect and preserve. One of them is that it is fundamentally a network of networks, of independent networks that voluntarily interconnect. That's a very important feature of the internet. Another important feature is that it's done so via open standards, that it enables other networks to join and for new contributors to spin up a new service, for example. Another important feature is that it doesn't really have a central authority. Mm-hmm. There's no center in a network of networks, which means that if you want to build a new service, you can do so. You can use this global connectivity to produce a new service and reach new people. But also a really important characteristic that I think is very closely related to this question about consolidation is that one of the beliefs that we have around the internet is that it doesn't have any permanent favorites. So the idea here is that the internet is fundamentally driven by a kind of ethos that good ideas can be overtaken by even better ideas. And this applies both to technology, where, for example, you might have had Internet Protocol version 4, so IPv4 was a great idea. But perhaps an even better idea is to have a protocol with an even bigger address space, right? So we see that transitioning from IPv4 to IPv6. So there's no permanent favorites even when it comes to technology. We've had the same beliefs also when it came to services that were being deployed online. So, the innovations that make use of the internet, you might have started with an application like Gopher, then being overtaken by the web. You might have had Alta Vista being a search engine, being overtaken by Google. MySpace was at some point overtaken by Facebook. So you have this sort of dynamic character of the internet. And we think this is a really important feature of the internet as a network. So those are some of the things that you should see as sort of a backdrop to why an organization like the Internet Society gets interested in a topic like this. And this sort of explains why this particular report is really one in a series of reports that we've been doing for a couple of years. So I think it's since 2014 we've been producing these annual reports looking at particular thematics that relates to the internet. And the one report before this report was a report we produced in 2017 where we tried to look at the future of the internet. So this coincided with our 25th anniversary. And what we did was essentially go out and consult with experts in our community, trying to understand what will the internet look like in 2025 and what will be the driving forces taking us there. And one of the driving forces that was identified was the internet economy, and particularly a concern that we were facing a future where you would have less competition in the internet economy. So for an organization that is fundamentally interested about preserving and promoting this networking model of independent, globally connected networks, we were curious to see, okay, is there a trend of consolidation in the internet economy? And if so, if we look at more detail, what is the actual impact on that network of networks? So that is a little bit of the background to why we did this report.
Oh, excellent. All right. So what might be some of the key findings, having done the research and produced the report?
So I think it's important to just start with sort of acknowledging that consolidation is something that occurs in virtually all industries, right? Like most industries goes through different stages of market maturity. So in that regard, consolidation is not particularly strange. Well, it's important to acknowledge that the internet economy really encompasses a whole set of different markets. And the definition that we used in this report is that the internet economy consists of those activities that either support the internet coming into being or that is fundamentally dependent on the internet. So if you think about something supporting the internet coming into being, you would think about an internet service provider, for example. While a economic activity that is fundamentally dependent on the internet would be something using that connectivity. So for example, a social media network or a streaming service that wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the internet. So that's where we started. We try to find a definition of the internet economy and then try to break it down. And when we did that, we found essentially three different domains. So the first one was internet applications. So anything that essentially makes use of the global connectivity to deploy a service and find customers over the internet. Mm-hmm. The second domain was access provisions. Of course, the last mile connectivity that we as a user or as a business use in order to connect to the global internet. And then the third domain is what we call service infrastructure, which is a compilation of different markets that supports this internet coming into being, whether it's, transit, whereby larger networks help connect smaller networks, or cloud computing, for example, where people host their applications, DNS services in order to run the DNS system, all of those sort of complementary services that helps the internet coming into being. And when we looked at these three domains, what we saw was essentially trends of consolidation in all three of them. Now, it's important to note that when we did this, we were really taking a sort of a bird's eye view of things, because if you want to look at a particular market, let's say, go deeper into cloud computing, you really need to do an in-depth analysis of that particular market in order to more firmly talk about that industry being consolidated. But we were interested in this big picture, right? So we did sort of a bird's eye view analysis looking at the various markets in these domains. And what we saw were trends of consolidation in all of them. So that is one of the findings. But of course, for our organization, the key thing here is, okay, so what is then the implication for the internet, right?
Absolutely.
And in that regard, we spent a lot of time in this report, which is the second section of the report, where we're trying to tease out, what are the key takeaways from this. So one key takeaway, for example, is that we're seeing what you could say is a changing internet topology, whereby you have a greater or a lesser reliance on transit networks, but you have a more densely interconnection of access networks and networks at the edge through IXPs, for example, but also because you have the proliferation of content delivery networks that suddenly brings a lot of the content closer to the access networks. So the sum outcome of all of this is that you have a slightly lesser reliance on transit networks that used to be a huge and still is a very important part of the internet. But that is sort of a feature of this consolidation that we are interested in, because it brings a lot of benefits for both users and for the networks themselves. Users get lower latency and better access to content. The networks are more densely interconnected, which implies greater reliance. But at the same time, it is a change in the topology for how it's been over the past couple of years. So it's important to understand what the implications of that could be. Another thing that we would look at is, for example, the implications for standards development and deployment, where we saw both very sort of positive indications from consolidation and concentration in some markets, where some of these big players are actually nudging the adoption of very important standards like IPv6 or encryption on the web. But on the other hand, we also see the same large players, they have a great deal of influence in terms of the new protocols that gets developed. And those new protocols are still developed in an open fashion. They go through the collaborative processes. But because they are so big, it sort of raises the question down the line, could we end up in a situation where protocols are essentially becoming deployed by benevolent rule makers, if you will, rather than being developed in a collaborative fashion, simply because a few big players have such influence on the standardization process.
Right.
But overall, like all of these areas that we identified, so we highlight 5 areas in this report, all of them both have sort of positive issues related to them, where we see a lot of benefits coming out, but also raises some concerns and question marks. And that is really the big takeaway from the report, that consolidation is not a clear-cut issue. It has a lot of benefits, and it also raises some new questions that we think is important to fully understand the implication of consolidation.
Understood. And yeah, definitely, because I think we have can appreciate is that consolidation in many jurisdictions and in many markets, and there's a lot of historical evidence to recognize that it does occur. But one of the questions that we now need to ask, as you said, is what are the implications? So
right.
What might be, at least in the first instance, implications for the internet economy going forward?
So, I think the implications for the internet economy is to a large extent what you would see in any other market, right? You have a type of stagnation where obviously consolidation in of itself implies that you have fewer market players coming into the market, and the barriers for entry is extremely high. So that implies, of course, that the internet economy would more and more dependent on a few large players in order to progress, both in terms of the innovations that might be deployed or the access for new players into that particular market. So if we purely look at it from the internet economy perspective in terms of the actors involved, consolidation would imply that you have this type of stagnation of the same players essentially being featured in the future. But that is, to one extent, that is a concern if you think about this idea of non-permanent favorites, where we expect the internet to be very dynamic. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the networks itself is implicated by that. It could just be that the same operations works perfectly. It's just that you have a tendency of having the same players operating it. So from the internet economy perspective, I think what you will see, the implication is essentially what you see in any other domain, stagnation in terms of the players participating.
Yeah. But then that now brings me to how might developing countries like those in the Caribbean be affected. I think, I guess, to a considerable degree, we sort of see ourselves as being on the edges of what is happening. And I'm not sure if we fully appreciate how we might be affected by it. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, this is, if you look at the report, for example, one of the main outcome questions of the report is this is something that we really think deserves more research, right? What is the actual implications for developing countries and bridging a digital divide? And you could see consolidation on one hand being a driver of demand for access, both because of, a social network like Facebook is essentially you participate with your friends. And if for example, local language was once a barrier, you're communicating with others that are producing content in the same language. So in that way, you can mitigate some of these demand side issues of internet access. Similarly, there's been instances where researchers have looked at the introduction of a new language on just the Google search interface and how that spurs internet adoption in turn, simply because the internet gets slightly more accessible for for some parts of the world, and predominantly developing countries, that has had this issue of the demand side for access being a challenge for adoption. Now, when we look at the supply side, I think the picture is a little bit trickier. It could be that the concentration in the market could create some barriers. So, for example, one of my former colleagues, Michael Kendi, who was the chief economist here, he looked at what he called the mobile app divide. So in this instance, it referred to the contrast between developed and developing countries in terms of access to app stores like Google Play. So, for example, developers from some parts of the world could not sell their applications on an app store. Mm-hmm. So if you have this instance where you have a concentration on one of the platforms that proves to be very important for an economic activity, in this instance, buying and selling apps, mm-hmm. and it is essentially a proprietary platform that is quite distinct from, the open web, then you could have a problem with consolidation in the sense that it might lock out some parts of the world from a particular platform because it is distinct from the open web, right?
Yeah.
So it's one of those issues that we want to learn a little bit more about because, as I mentioned, on the one hand, there seems to be some positive aspects to it in terms of driving demand. On the other hand, the question is, okay, once you have that access, can you contribute to the internet as a whole and effectively contribute as other parts of the world in this consolidated environment? True.
With respect to developing countries, one of the things that I think I noted in the report, there was a recognition that with probably for many of these major platforms, the markets in developing countries are probably getting saturated. So a lot of them are looking now at developing countries to continue to build out their customer base, as well as, I guess, to become a force in those areas. I am wondering what might be your thoughts on just the fact that these major platforms in particular can come into developing countries and basically just take them over, and there'll probably be no competition in sight. Whereas probably, let's say, like in developing countries where you have had the evolution from, let's say, as you said, like Alta Vista and Yahoo in terms of search engines to Google and so on. Right now, you're just getting Google, for example. What might be your thoughts on that? Because I think whether or not, or the extent to which developing countries will have the full sort of internet experience, I think is something that concerns me.
I would say that in terms of ensuring that developing countries can participate in the internet economy going forward, I would say that one of the critical parts of that is really to ensure this networking model that is the internet, because that networking model is essentially allowing anyone to set up a new service on that global connectivity. Mm-hmm. So in part, it's a matter of building capacity to take advantage of that global infrastructure and to build your own services as well that can be part of the competition towards these big players. Because as you framed it, these largely Western companies get access to markets in developing countries, but the other way is true as well, right? Like you get access to a global market if you're in a developing country.
Right.
So I think it's a matter of ensuring that both the networks facilitate this opportunity, meaning that you don't have policies or regulations that could restrict the opportunity to take advantage of the network, but also that you build capacity in those countries to actually be able to build your own services and do not being sort of reliant on just those actors coming in from abroad. So it's sort of a dual side where you need to have the capacity to fully utilize the global connectivity that the internet brings. But mm-hmm. if you don't have that networking model of the internet in the first place, you're sort of constraining your options to begin with.
Fair enough. And therefore, it leads me now to the whole question about innovation and entrepreneurship, since one was saying about how, I guess, developing countries themselves also need to figure out ways to leverage the internet for themselves. Mm-hmm. So how do you think the consolidation will affect entrepreneurship and innovation?
So innovation and entrepreneurship depends a little bit on where you look at it and from what perspective you look at it, because some of these trends that we see, especially in cloud computing, implies that you you have a development towards a global infrastructure for a lot of the small and medium enterprises that is quite incredible if you just compare it 5-10 years back, right? So you get access to cloud computing capabilities and also other capabilities like machine learning or artificial intelligence, global content delivery networks. All of this is sort of available as a service through some of these large cloud providers. So in that regard, you can see new opportunities for innovation and entrepreneurship because of this global infrastructure. But then you also have the reality of that, which is that there's a risk of new innovations becoming dependent on just a few large cloud providers that has the capacity to deploy this global infrastructure. And then there's also, from a technical perspective, a concern where sort of the expectations of what a open standard could bring in terms of innovation may not conform to the expectations. So if you take, for example, email standards, they are the typical example in this case. Over time, or since the time of their design, they had the expectation that there would be many providers out there operating in a somewhat uncoordinated fashion. You would have multiple email servers around the world. You would be able to spin up your email service if you wanted. I can do it. But today it's quite hard to run your own email service because of the concentration in the market. Both because of spam, of course. You need a huge infrastructure in order to mitigate spam, but also sort of a unfortunate unintended consequence of that is that if you spin up your own email service, you might not be accessible, or you might not have access to people using one of the big cloud providers because your domain might be filtered out.
Right.
So the sort of expectations of what you can do with an open protocol like that might be an unintended consequence from this concentration where the sort of utility of those open standards are diminished. And that is, of course, a big concern if that is the case.
Right. Okay. So, granted that the premise of the internet and even what the Internet Society stands for in terms of being open, global, secure, trustworthy, what are your thoughts on regulation and whether or not, you think regulation is necessary going forward?
To one degree, this is a bit of an unknown, but of course, there's obvious examples where regulation is likely to actually reinforce a trend of consolidation, right? So take the example of the very sort of extreme cases where you have the type of forced data localization whereby a company is obliged to keep certain data within the national border. In this instance, you're forcing a provider to keep the data at a place that might not be deemed as the most efficient place to keep that data. And in this sense, you're sort of imposing a constraint through data localization for which only the largest providers can comply with. So, if you look at some of the largest cloud providers today, you can see that the very ability to ensure regulatory compliance is, throughout various jurisdictions is actually one of the strong selling points from the perspective of using one of these big providers. So
Right.
Regulatory impact could have the unintended consequence of actually sort of reinforcing consolidation trend. But a lot of those implications are unknown today, and that's why we are, dedicating more time looking at exactly how competition policy or regulation in the more broader sense can in turn impact consolidation, either to the benefit of creating a more competitive market, but also these instances where it might actually reinforce consolidation, or in the very worst instance, even have an impact on the network itself.
Understood. And I'm wondering now, would you have similar thoughts about whether or not, like the big online platforms that may seem to have a monopoly, whether they should be broken up? I'm sure you're aware that there has been a lot of discussion with respect to Facebook, and even I think one of the co-founders coming out to say that they think that Facebook has gotten too powerful and needs to be broken up. What might be your thoughts?
Right. I mean, this is definitely something that we're following these statements. I mean, we see them coming out not least in the U.S. primary campaigns that are currently ongoing. But I would say, if you look back at our report, one of our main messages is actually that policymakers should approach this topic with some caution, and that there is still, a great deal that we need to learn. And in a way, there is a concern that some of these statements or ideas of breaking up these companies, it could have the risk of sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, if you will.
Understood.
Many of these companies clearly provide quite important benefits to users, right? And then there's also a question of what the result would be from breaking them up. So if you take, for example, if you want to break up Facebook because it's too big, what is there to say that a new social media platform of similar size and influence wouldn't emerge, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of sort of outstanding questions as to if this is actually a good idea, and I think this deserves a little bit more thinking. And this goes back to sort of a general questions of how competition law may affect the internet itself. So, so is there a risk of actions or policies that would impede a network or set precedents that sort of undermine the general utility of using this network? Like we were talking about, for example, the utility of using the internet for industries in developing countries.
Right.
And I think that the answer is that we don't really know, right? We still need to learn a little bit more. And this is also, one of the things that if you take an entity like the Internet Architectural Board, they're also looking at consolidation, but they're approaching this from the technical perspective, trying to understand if there's any technical factors, whether in, protocol design, for example, that could explain why you have a concentration and why you have what is seemingly large player advantages. So right. All of that to say is that some of this consolidation might not have a straightforward answer, and sort of rush judgment in terms of what needs to be done could have rather unintended consequences that is important to be aware of and to consider.
Understood. I mean, I'm as you're talking, and from all that you've said, I'm just wondering whether or not the better approach, and I guess whether or not you have any thoughts on it, might be almost to let nature take its course. And yes, the internet might implode, but the outcome in the long run would be better. It seems a bit drastic, but that's
Well, I mean, hopefully it wouldn't implode, but I think that the sort of sentiment that you're expressing in the sense of give the internet a chance, I think it's the right one. In that we see these trends of consolidation, which is worrying for our organization, not least because it sort of challenges our belief that the internet doesn't have any permanent favorites. Mm-hmm. At the same time, should we just throw in the towel now, or should we have a little bit of faith in the internet, learn a little bit more about why this consolidation is happening in order to see what is the best course of action?
Yeah.
So I fully agree with you that, hopefully it doesn't implode. That would be horrible, but
yes.
Have a little bit of faith in the model, I think.
I guess what I liken it to is almost like the stock exchange, where I think the internet is still quite young, and we really haven't yet been through a full cycle of whatever it is, such right. that, so for example, you have the highs and lows of the stock exchange, and every so often you have this very severe situation that happens, but at the end of the day, systems improve, we become a little bit more vigilant, and yes, eventually that vigilance begins to erode, but then you go up into this, the upswell, and then another situation happens. So that may be something similar that will happen with the internet, but I think it's too early for us to tell.
Yeah, as you say, we're not 100% sure where we are in the cycle, perhaps. So it's important to take that into consideration and give it a little bit more time, I would say. And as you say, in sort of in the perspective of time, we're talking about, companies that have been around for 10, 15, 20 years tops. And the internet has still been progressing since then.
Yeah, so I guess as much as we've been talking about the consolidation of the internet, one of the things that I think has been emerging is the fractures that are being evident in the internet as well, whereby one I think that readily comes to mind is almost an internet in China and then the internet in the rest of the world. Do you have any thoughts on that?
From my perspective, I think it's sort of useful to think about these trends as something that is moving away from an ideal, right? So the model of networking that we see advocated for in some parts of the world that has the features where, data is forced to stay local, or where interconnection is fundamentally a political decision, that from our point of view, that really runs contrary to the internet model, right? So in our view, there's an enormous value in these independent networks voluntarily interconnecting. So to the extent that this internet model is promoted, then yes, or to the extent it's not promoted, I should say, yes, then you will see fractures. But I think what it fundamentally indicates is that the internet is really more than just cables and bandwidth, right? Yes. It's really about protecting an ethos and protecting principles. And I think that's where our organization fits in very well, because our understanding of the internet comes down to these very fundamental idea that the internet is a particular way of interconnecting networks, and that the way that they interconnect is important. Voluntary interconnection, the fact that there's open standards to facilitate that interconnection. So in that sense, yes, there's absolutely this sort of trend where you have alternative networking models being promoted. But I think that the best way to challenge them is to reinforce the current internet model.
Understood. Okay, so and my final question, what are 3 takeaways that developing countries in particular should consider as they develop strategies or position themselves for the internet economy?
So I think, this is often spoken about, but I think that it has to be a very clear recognition by policymakers that it's becoming increasingly costly to be offline. So if you're a citizen in your country, you really need to ensure that all people can get a connection to the internet and have access to the internet. So I would say that is the key takeaway number 1, is to keep at efforts to expand internet access, because that is the way to sort of keep par and stay with the current trends and how the internet is evolving in itself. Because if you're not connected to the internet, you can't be part of shaping its evolution, essentially.
Right.
I would say also to developing countries to think about resilience, right? To ensure that your networks are able and have the capacity to have multiple connections, not least because the internet is such an intrinsic part of our economic life. You want to make sure that you have redundancy and that the networks can actually be allowed to have multiple connections, so you don't try to constrain that politically, for example.
Right.
And sort of underpinning both of those points is this notion of the internet as a networking model, to keep promoting that as the way for your societies to become part of the greater whole that is the internet. So to ensure that principles of voluntary interconnection, to be able to use open standards, that they aren't prohibited, I think is a very critical part of ensuring that these countries can be part of the future.
Okay. Yeah, those are very powerful takeaways, because I think, as you rightfully said, you have to be part of it to be able to gain the benefits, and resilience and redundancy are critical, especially as it becomes integral to your society. You really don't want, for whatever reason,
Yeah.
Yes.
I was going to say, because you were saying to be part of it, to take the benefits of it, but I think it's also important to really emphasize to be part of it to help shape it for the future.
Absolutely.
Because you were mentioning, right, so what is the role of people in developing countries in this consolidated environment? Well, hopefully the role of people coming online is to help shape that internet environment to what they need, to what they need that connectivity for. So it's not only reaping the benefits of the current internet, but also to be able to add new benefits for the internet's users. Because I think that is a critical sort of message to policymakers in these countries, that by connecting your citizens, you're also allowing them to contribute not only to your economies, but others' economies, and to the sort of greater whole that is the internet, and not just be sort of passive consumers of the internet.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So, Carl, thank you so much. I think that, and I'm going to encourage all of you who might be listening to this to really examine the Internet Society's report. It is eye-opening from the perspective that as it's very straightforward in how it has been presented, but it does force us to think a lot more about the internet economy and how we might be affected by, and when I say we, our societies might be affected by the trends that might be emerging. And from policymakers to members of the private sector, I think we could all just benefit from being a little bit more aware, and hopefully looking more closely at strategies and policies that we are promoting in our countries where the internet is concerned, and how we perceive ourselves, especially in developing countries, in being connected to the internet. So, Carl, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and for sharing with us your insights, and I guess those are generally of the Internet Society as well, on this important issue.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com, or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.